She worked in silence, invisible, just an assistant to a powerful billionaire who never even looked her in the eye. But when he needed a date for the most exclusive gala in New York, he chose her, without care, without emotion. What he didn't expect was that the woman he never noticed would become the center of every room and of his heart. But what happened after that night, no one in the city was prepared for. If this story moves you, tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? Your support helps us share more stories like this one. In the glass tower that pierced the Manhattan skyline, Grant Maddox ruled his empire with a silent fist and steely eyes. His company, Maddox Innovations, had redefined tech efficiency across industries, from finance to aerospace. But those who worked closest to him knew, Grant didn't just demand excellence. He demanded invisibility. Emotions were distractions, faces were files, names were simply calendar attachments. And that's exactly how he saw Olivia Hart. She had been his executive assistant for 2 years. Not once had he looked her in the eye for more than 3 seconds. Not once had he asked her how she was, but she had memorized his schedule better than his smartwatch, predicted his moods better than any algorithm, and protected him from human chaos with almost inhuman grace. She walked 3 steps behind him, always. Her voice was measured, her clothes neutral, her hair always in a neat bun. Invisible, efficient, flawless. Grant never noticed that Olivia never laughed at his clients' jokes, that she stayed late every Thursday to send flowers to the mother he barely visited, that her hands trembled the day she received a call and left the office crying quietly. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. Because in Grant's world, feelings were a liability, and personal was poison, until that Tuesday morning. The boardroom buzzed with muted voices. Grant, flanked by 2 of his longtime friends and fellow CEOs, Charles Whitmore and Marcus Delgado, was half listening to the conversation about the upcoming annual Innovation Gala. "And let me guess," Charles teased, swirling his coffee in a silver thermos, "you're going solo, again." Marcus chuckled. "Grant, your image may be brilliant, but you're starting to look like a cyborg. A little mystery woman by your side wouldn't kill you." Grant smirked, unfazed. "Women at these things are distractions. Or advantages," Marcus countered. "You can close billion-dollar deals in a tux, but show up with the right woman? People pay attention differently." Charles leaned in. "Unless you just don't know anyone who fits the part?" The air thickened. For the first time in years, Grant felt something flare inside his chest. Not rage, but a flicker of irritation that settled dangerously close to his pride. Without blinking, he responded, "I already have someone." Charles raised a brow. "Really?" Grant nodded once. "My assistant." Both men laughed. Grant didn't. There was a pause. Then Marcus asked, "The woman who never speaks? Hart, right? Pretty sure she blends into the walls." Grant's voice cut through the room like a blade. "She's not what you think." He had no idea why he said that. And as he walked out, silence trailing behind him like a cloak, the truth hit him harder than he expected. He had just made a promise. To them and to himself. By the time he reached his office, Olivia was seated at her desk, typing silently. Her posture perfect, her presence as unnoticed as always. He stopped, watched her for a second longer than usual, then spoke. "Olivia." She looked up. "Yes, Mr. Maddox? I need you to attend the gala with me Friday, 7 sharp." Olivia froze. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Excuse me?" she asked softly. "It's not personal, just optics. You'll wear something appropriate. I'll have a stylist sent. The car will pick you up at 6:30, that's all." And with that, he walked into his office and shut the door. But behind him, Olivia sat stunned, cheeks flushed, lips parted, heart pounding. She wasn't sure what shocked her more, the request, or how cold it felt. He hadn't even looked at her. It wasn't a compliment, it was a command. She was being packaged, like another part of his image. But as her initial shock settled, something else took its place. A quiet fire. She could have said no. She almost did. But then a voice inside whispered, "If you're going to be seen, let them see all of you." Olivia stood, her spine straightening. For 2 years she had hidden herself in silence. Now she would rewrite everything. As she typed, "Yes, Mr. Maddox, I'll be ready," her reflection in the monitor caught her eye. And for the first time in months, Olivia smiled, not for him, but for the woman she was about to become. Because she wasn't just accepting an invitation, she was accepting a challenge. And Grant Maddox had no idea what he'd just unleashed. The next morning, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm. Yellow taxis honking down Fifth Avenue, the scent of roasted chestnuts mingling with the chill of early spring, and Manhattan's elite slipping into mirrored towers like clockwork. Inside Maddox Innovations, the energy was different. Whispers rippled across departments like a low current. People had seen Grant speaking directly to Olivia the day before. That alone was rare enough to be noticed. But more than that, rumor had it he'd invited her to the annual Innovation Gala. "Her?" someone whispered near the elevators. "The assistant with the glasses?" No, the one who never goes to lunch." Olivia ignored the murmurs. Her heels tapped lightly on the marble floor as she made her way to her desk, coffee in hand, hair still tied back in that same discreet knot. But inside, something had shifted. She had spent most of the night thinking, not about the dress or the public eyes or even Grant, but about herself. For years she had made herself smaller, quiet, reliable, efficient. She had swallowed every opinion, buried every ambition, and folded herself into the background like an afterthought. It wasn't that she lacked confidence, she had simply been surviving. But now she wasn't just surviving, she was choosing. So when the stylist arrived later that afternoon, a polished woman named Celeste, who looked like she'd walked out of Vogue, Olivia didn't hesitate. "We'll need measurements," Celeste said, walking a slow circle around her, "and shoes, and hair options. Are you open to color?" Olivia nodded calmly. "I'm open to being seen." Celeste paused, smiled. "Then let's begin." Meanwhile, across the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, Grant tried, and failed, to concentrate. The air around him felt unsettled. Since the boardroom dare, he hadn't stopped thinking about his own impulsiveness. He rarely made decisions that weren't calculated. But something about Charles's mocking tone, Marcus's smug grin, it had stirred something he didn't recognize. And now the consequences of that moment were walking through his office in 3-inch heels and being measured for a gown. He glanced toward the glass and caught a glimpse of Olivia standing beside the stylist. Her posture was straight. Her hands were clasped in front of her. But there was something in the tilt of her chin, something defiant in her silence, that unnerved him. He looked away, and for the first time in years he realized he didn't have control over this. The following day brought another surprise. Grant's phone buzzed, a calendar notification, not set by him. Thursday, 2 p.m., fitting review. Olivia Hart. He frowned. That wasn't his style. But before he could call it off, Olivia knocked once on his open door. "Just wanted to confirm," she said softly. "You'll be attending the final fitting preview tomorrow. The tailor requested your presence." He blinked. "I wasn't aware I was needed." "You insisted on the optics," she replied, voice neutral. "This is part of that." There was no sarcasm in her words, only quiet determination. She met his eyes and held his gaze for just a moment longer than usual. Something flickered in his chest. He didn't understand it, so he dismissed it. "I'll be there." The day of the fitting, he arrived at a discreet studio tucked between art galleries in Soho. It was more intimate than he expected. Soft light, polished floors, racks of silk and tulle whispering in every corner. And then she stepped out from behind the velvet curtain. Olivia. But not the Olivia he knew. Her hair, usually pulled back in a stern bun, now fell in soft waves around her face. Her makeup was subtle but transformative, drawing attention to her eyes, eyes that no longer avoided his. The gown she wore was deep navy, form-fitting, with an elegant slit and delicate embroidery that shimmered like constellations when she moved. She didn't look like his assistant. She looked like a storm wrapped in moonlight. And Grant couldn't breathe. She approached him slowly. "So?" she asked, voice even. He cleared his throat. It's appropriate, he said. Olivia arched an eyebrow. Appropriate? Grant nodded once, his mask slipping back into place. Yes, you'll fit the role. A flicker of something, disappointment, passed through her, but she masked it well. I'm not playing a role, Mr. Maddox, she replied, her voice cool. I'm just showing up. And before he could respond, she turned to the tailor to make final adjustments. That night, Grant lay awake in his penthouse suite, lights off, city buzzing far below, trying to push the image of Olivia in that dress out of his mind. But it wasn't just the dress. It was the way she stood, the quiet fire behind her words, the fact that, for the first time, he hadn't known what to say. He didn't like being off balance, and yet for reasons he couldn't articulate, part of him didn't want to get that balance back. The gala was 2 nights away, and something told him it wouldn't be just another corporate evening. What he didn't know, or what he couldn't know, was that by daring to bring her into his world, he had unknowingly invited a spark into the coldest room of his soul. And once it was lit, there would be no going back. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Olivia's apartment, casting golden slits across the hardwood floor. She sat at her small kitchen table, a mug of tea warming her hands, staring at the message on her phone. Gala, Friday, Ikasha, 7 p.m. The Met Atrium. The words were simple, typed in the neutral tone of her own assistant's calendar app. But behind those 5 words lived a complicated silence. She took a deep breath. The dress was ready. The heels, far higher than she was used to, had been broken in walking laps around her apartment. Her hair appointment was scheduled. Everything was in place. Everything except her heart. She wasn't nervous. Not exactly. What she felt was harder to name, a low hum under her ribs, part defiance, part vulnerability. For the first time in years, she wasn't showing up for someone else's needs. This time, she was showing up for herself. And if Grant Maddox thought she was just going to blend in quietly at his side, he was about to learn a lesson no merger or algorithm could ever teach. She arrived at work that morning, dressed just as she always had. Blazer, flat shoes, not a single hair out of place. But something in her walk had changed. It was in the way she held her shoulders, the way she looked directly at people instead of down at her tablet. Grant noticed it the moment she entered his office to hand him the revised itinerary. "You're early," he said without looking up. "I'm always early," she replied calmly. He finally glanced at her. There was something in her expression, something serene but firm, that made him pause. "About the gala," he began. "You'll be riding with me. A car will pick you up. I'll meet you there." He blinked. "Excuse me?" "I'll meet you there," she repeated, her voice still gentle. "I've made my own arrangements." There was no attitude, no rebellion in her tone, only quiet clarity. But to Grant, used to absolute compliance, it felt like a tremor in the structure he had so carefully built. "You're my guest, Olivia." "That means—" "No," she interrupted softly. "I'm your assistant, not your accessory. I agreed to attend, not to be managed." He stared at her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she offered a polite smile and turned to leave, her words lingering in the room like a faint perfume. Not to be managed. He leaned back in his chair, oddly unsettled. No one talked to him like that. No one except her. And for reasons he couldn't explain, part of him didn't want her to stop. That afternoon, Olivia walked to Central Park on her lunch break. Something she hadn't done in months. She needed air, stillness, and space to think. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Celeste, the stylist. "Final touches confirmed. You'll be radiant and unforgettable." Unforgettable. That word echoed. She hadn't meant to make this about revenge, but the truth was, part of her was tired. Tired of being overlooked, tired of doing everything right and still being invisible. So yes, she would walk into that room not just as an assistant. She would walk in as herself. Later that night, Olivia stood in front of her bedroom mirror, wrapped in a robe, her hair pinned in loose spirals, as she rehearsed answers in her head. What if someone asked about her role, her background? What if they laughed? But every time doubt crept in, she heard her mother's voice. "You were never meant to shrink just to keep others comfortable." She closed her eyes and whispered, "You've got this." Meanwhile, across the city, Grant sat in his penthouse with a glass of scotch, reading a Forbes article about his own company. A genius, but ice-cold, the enigma of Maddox Innovations. He didn't mind the reputation. It had served him well. Power, control, results. But tonight, it grated. Because it was true. He had built a world so tightly wound that no one could breathe near him. And yet Olivia, she breathed just fine. He didn't know when she had stopped fearing him. Maybe she never had. Maybe she had simply waited until she was ready. And now he wasn't sure who was walking into the gala beside him, but he knew one thing. She wasn't the same woman who answered his calls at midnight or typed notes without a word. He had asked her to fill a role. But she had taken that request and made it a mission. Not to prove something to him, to prove something to herself. And that was far more dangerous. Because in doing so, she had become unforgettable for reasons that had nothing to do with a dress. And deep inside, beneath the steel of his self-control, something fragile began to shift. A quiet reckoning he wasn't ready to face. But it was coming. He could feel it. It was in the silence between her words, in the fire behind her gaze, in the way she no longer asked for permission, and for a man who thought he could control everything. Nothing had ever terrified him more. The grand atrium of the Metropolitan Museum shimmered like a jewel box that night. Crystal chandeliers floated overhead, like galaxies frozen in time. Strings of golden light cascaded down from the mezzanine. Men in tuxedos stood tall with glasses of bourbon, and women in couture dresses flowed like silk flames across the marble floor. The Innovation Gala wasn't just a celebration of technology. It was a battlefield of status, influence, and legacy. Grant Maddox arrived precisely at 7 p.m., escorted through the side entrance reserved for the major donors. His presence, as always, sent a ripple through the room. People straightened their posture. Conversations shifted. Camera flashes trailed him discreetly. He was the same as ever, tailored in midnight black, crisp and unreadable. The wolf among men. But tonight, he was not the one they would remember. Not after she walked in. A moment before her arrival, the main entrance opened, not with fanfare, but with a hush. Heads turned one by one like dominoes, tipping silently. At the top of the staircase stood Olivia. For a heartbeat, the room stilled. She didn't rush. She didn't pose. She simply descended the stairs with the quiet grace of someone who belonged, not because she was announced, but because she had decided to belong. The navy gown hugged her silhouette with elegance, but it was the way she carried herself that stole every breath from the air. Her hair was swept into a loose side wave, exposing one shoulder and a delicate pair of earrings that caught the light just enough. Her lips were painted in a shade that hinted at softness and control, but most arresting of all were her eyes. They didn't search for Grant. They didn't search for approval. They searched for no one. Because for the first time in a very long time, Olivia Hart walked into a room as the main character of her own story. Grant turned toward the crowd and spotted her the same moment Dylan Hayes did. Dylan, Maddox Innovations' oldest rival, charming and reckless, let out a low whistle as he approached Olivia with his signature grin. "Now, this is an unexpected delight," Dylan said, holding out his hand. "I don't believe we've met. And trust me, I'd remember." Olivia smiled politely. "Olivia Hart." "Hart?" he repeated, eyes narrowing with sudden interest. "As in Maddox's assistant?" "That's right," she replied smoothly, accepting his handshake. Dylan chuckled. "Well, well, either Grant's tastes have improved dramatically, or he finally opened his eyes." Before she could respond, another voice cut through the crowd. "Dylan!" It was sharp, controlled, possessive. Grant. He was already at Olivia's side, his jaw tight, his hand brushing the small of her back, as if to remind everyone, and perhaps himself, that she was with him. "Miss Hart," he said, ignoring Dylan entirely, "you look appropriate." Olivia tilted her head, her smile still intact. "That's quite the compliment, Mr. Maddox." She turned her gaze back to Dylan. "Would you excuse me?" And just like that, she placed her hand lightly on Grant's arm and walked away with him. Not because he asked, but because she chose to. They walked toward the center of the room, where the donors were gathering for the opening toast. Grant's mind was spinning, though his face gave nothing away. She was stunning, that much was obvious, but it wasn't just that. It was the way she had handled Dylan, with poise, power, and disarming calm. She hadn't needed Grant. She had commanded the moment entirely on her own, and it unsettled him. They stood together while the mayor gave a speech about innovation and ethics, but Grant barely registered the words. He glanced sideways at Olivia, who was listening attentively, her chin slightly lifted, eyes focused. She looked like she belonged on magazine covers, on boards of directors, at the head of a company, not behind a desk, typing agendas and shielding his moods. And he realized he had never really seen her, not until now. After the speech ended, he leaned closer, his voice low. "You're making quite an impression." Olivia turned to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm not here to impress anyone," she said. "I'm just being myself." The words struck deeper than he expected. Before he could respond, a woman approached, one of the evening's hosts, asking for a photo of the two of them. Cameras clicked, flashes burst, and Grant felt a strange discomfort settle in his chest. He'd brought her to prove something to others, but now, he wasn't sure who he was trying to impress anymore. As the evening unfolded, Olivia glided through conversations with ease. She spoke to CEOs about global impact, to city officials about youth entrepreneurship, to investors about emerging markets. People gravitated toward her, not because of her beauty, but because of her clarity, her insight, her effortless intelligence. Grant watched from across the room, arms folded, unable to look away. She was luminous, and he was invisible. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't the one everyone was watching. It wasn't jealousy, it was revelation. Halfway through the evening, a string quartet began to play. The lights dimmed slightly, casting a warm golden glow across the atrium. Grant approached Olivia again. "Dance with me." It wasn't a question. She turned toward him slowly. "Are you asking?" she said gently. "Or assuming?" He hesitated. Then, with the barest trace of vulnerability in his voice, "I'm asking." She studied him for a moment, then placed her hand in his. They moved to the dance floor. At first they danced like colleagues, careful, distant, but as the music swelled, something shifted. His hand rested on her back longer than it should have. Her fingertips lingered against his shoulder. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to say. Everything was already in the silence. The music faded. They stood close, not moving. Olivia looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't see me, Grant." "Not really." His brow furrowed. "I'm seeing you now." "No," she said. "You're noticing me now. There's a difference." He opened his mouth, but the words never came, because deep down, he knew she was right. She stepped back slowly, her hand slipping from his, and as she walked away into the crowd, Grant stood frozen, surrounded by chandeliers and applause and elegance, but feeling something strange and rare settle over him like fog. For the first time, he felt the weight of his own blindness. And he knew something had changed forever. Because while she disappeared among the shimmering figures of that grand night, the most powerful man in the room finally understood what he had truly lost all these years. It wasn't prestige or control. It was her. The Monday after the gala arrived, cloaked in gray rain and Manhattan silence. Outside, umbrellas knocked shoulders along Madison Avenue. Inside Maddox Innovations, however, something even colder swept through the building. The shift in dynamic between Grant Maddox and Olivia Hart had become palpable. People noticed. In the elevators, glances passed. In the break rooms, murmurs floated. "Did you see the photos? Was that really her? Do you think they're—" Olivia said nothing. She moved through the halls with the same posture, the same focus, but now there was a weightlessness to her walk. A quiet confidence that made even the most seasoned executives pause. She didn't need approval. She knew who she was now. And Grant? He was no longer sure who he was around her. He hadn't slept well since the gala, not because of regrets, but because of realizations. Her words haunted him. "You're noticing me now. There's a difference." And she had been right. He had always seen her as efficient, reliable, a tool. But now he saw something he hadn't expected. Brilliance, depth, desire. And he didn't know how to handle it. The week pressed forward with brutal speed. A major acquisition deal loomed, a merger with the European cybersecurity firm Kronos Tech, rumored to be worth over $8 billion. Grant was in final negotiations with their legal team, and the pressure to close the deal had reached fever pitch. But there was a complication. The proposal required the integration of private encryption systems. Only one person in the company had audited those systems from start to finish, Olivia. Grant hadn't even realized that until his CTO mentioned her name in passing. "She built the compliance report. If we get sued for breach, her documentation's our only cover," the man had said. Grant looked up. "She did all of it?" "She did more than all of it. She spotted vulnerabilities even Kronos missed. We're only in this deal because of her. I thought you knew." But he hadn't. Because back then he hadn't cared. And now he needed her. He knocked on her office door late that evening, something he'd never done before. Olivia glanced up, surprised. "Mr. Maddox?" "Grant," he corrected, his voice softer than usual. "Do you have a moment?" She nodded, standing slowly. They entered the conference room, the same one where she used to silently take notes while men in suits spoke over her head. Now she stood across from him at the table, her presence equal. "There's an urgent issue with the Kronos Tech deal," he said. "Your audit is at the center of it. I guess I didn't realize the extent of your involvement." Her eyes didn't soften. "That doesn't surprise me," she said. He exhaled. "I deserve that." Silence fell between them. The hum of the city outside was distant now, as if they stood inside a capsule, one filled with all the things they'd never said. "I need your help," he finally said, "but not just to clean up a mess. I want your input, strategy, review, implementation, not just as my assistant, as someone who clearly sees what I don't." She studied him carefully. "I'm not here to rescue you," she replied. "I'm here to do excellent work. That hasn't changed." "I know," he said. "What's changed is me." Her brows lifted, skeptical. He leaned forward slightly, voice lower. "You showed me that there's more power in presence than in control. That people don't follow leaders who are flawless, they follow leaders who see them." She didn't respond right away, but her silence wasn't rejection, it was consideration. "I'll review the documents tonight," she said finally. "You'll have my full report by morning." He nodded. "Thank you." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "You're changing," she said, not looking back, "but don't mistake transformation for redemption. They're not the same." And with that, she was gone. Grant stood alone in the conference room, the weight of her words heavier than any contract. Back in her apartment, Olivia worked into the night, not because she was trying to prove herself, but because she believed in the work, in excellence, in truth. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of hurt and disappointment, she still carried a flicker of hope that the man behind the power could become someone worthy of trust. But trust had to be earned and tested. The next morning, her report was waiting on Grant's desk at 7:30 sharp. He read it word for word, every note, every correction, every solution she had proposed. It wasn't just brilliant, it was visionary. By noon, he called an emergency board meeting. At that meeting, he laid out a revised plan for the merger, one entirely based on Olivia's insights. He gave her full credit, publicly, by name. Several board members blinked in surprise. One of them even muttered, "Did he just say her name?" After the meeting, as the executives filtered out, Grant stayed seated, staring at the city beyond his window. He'd spent years building an empire made of data and dominance, but he was just now discovering how powerful it was to build something based on respect. Later that evening, he found Olivia again, this time in the break room pouring herself a tea. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" she replied without turning. "For reminding me of the one thing I'd forgotten to value," he said. "People." She glanced at him now. "And what about the one thing you forgot to see?" she asked. He met her gaze. "You?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to, because her silence said everything. He'd seen her brilliance. He'd begun to understand her strength. But the part of her he hadn't reached, the part she still held back, was her heart. And she wasn't going to offer it easily. Not yet. And maybe not ever. Because once a woman learns to stand without applause, she stops needing permission to rise. The days that followed unfolded like a string pulled too tight. Everything looked composed from the outside, but tension buzzed beneath the surface. At Maddox Innovations, the air had changed. It wasn't just the murmurs or the sideways glances. It was the electricity between Olivia and Grant. Invisible, but undeniable. The way their eyes met during meetings. The silence that stretched a second too long when their hands brushed while exchanging documents. The way his tone softened only for her, and how her gaze sharpened when he spoke in rooms where no one else dared challenge him. They had entered dangerous territory, that fragile, fevered space between restraint and surrender. Olivia noticed it first in the small things. The way Grant began showing up earlier, always freshly shaven, tie perfectly knotted as if he were preparing not for a boardroom, but for her presence. The way he started asking questions, not just about figures, but about her thoughts, her opinions. He had stopped treating her like a tool. He had started listening, and she, despite her discipline, felt herself changing too. Late one night, they worked side by side in his office, the city twinkling beyond the windows like a field of stars. A storm had rolled in, rain streaking the glass, the low rumble of thunder echoing through the skyline. She leaned over his desk to point at a section of the merger contract. He turned his head to look at her. Too close. Their faces hovered inches apart. She froze. So did he. Time hung still in that space between a breath and a choice. Then she stepped back, her pulse fluttering in her throat like wings. "I should go," she whispered, gathering her notes. He stood too. "I'll walk you out." They moved through the halls without speaking, the click of her heels and the hum of fluorescent lights their only soundtrack. At the elevator, she turned to him. "Good night, Mr. Maddox." He hesitated. Then, slowly, "It's Grant. When it's just us." She searched his face, unsure whether to accept that offer. And then the elevator doors opened and she stepped inside, leaving him standing alone in the hallway, with a truth he could no longer deny. He wanted her, but not as a possession. He wanted her as an equal, as the woman who challenged him, as the one person he couldn't predict or control or replace. The next morning shattered the quiet build-up like glass on tile. Grant's office buzzed with urgent voices. His lead engineer barged in, pale and breathless. "We've been breached." Grant stood slowly. "Breach where?" "In the Chronostech interface. Someone tried to access the back-end encryption database using your company credentials." The room froze. "How serious?" he asked, voice cold. "If regulators find out," the engineer said, "the merger's dead, and so is our public trust." "Who had access?" Grant snapped. The answer came like a blade to the chest. Only one person had full permissions on that layer, Olivia Hart. The silence that followed was suffocating. Grant didn't blink. "No one moves until I see the logs myself." But within hours, the damage was done. News had already leaked. A high-level internal investigation into possible corporate sabotage. Olivia's name wasn't in the press release, but inside the company, whispers spread like wildfire. She was escorted out of her office at noon. Her computer seized, her badge deactivated, all without a single conversation. Grant watched from behind the glass, fury building behind his stoic mask. His legal team insisted it was standard protocol. His board demanded distance. His advisors warned him not to get personally involved, and in the end he didn't stop it, not publicly, not when it mattered most. He told himself he was protecting the company. He told himself it would all be resolved in private. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had failed her. Again. Olivia sat in her apartment that night, numb. Not from shock, but from the aching familiarity of betrayal. She had given them everything, her time, her brilliance, her loyalty. And in the moment it counted, they discarded her like a liability. Her phone rang 3 times that night. She didn't answer. Not when Grant called, not when his assistant texted, Not even when the firm's legal liaison tried to arrange a clarification meeting. She packed instead. 2 days later, she left Manhattan. No farewell, no press statement, no last words, just silence. And on the 51st floor of Maddox Innovations, Grant stood in his darkened office long after everyone else had gone, staring at the empty desk where she used to sit. He had built an empire on logic, but the only woman who had ever reached into his soul had vanished, because when she needed him to stand up, he disappeared. And now he was left with the one thing he couldn't rewrite, rebuild, or reprogram: regret. The rain returned on the day Olivia left New York. It didn't crash or rage, it whispered, like a quiet apology the city didn't know how to say. Drops slipped down the apartment window in slow trails as she folded the last of her clothes into a single suitcase. No drama, no fury. Just silence, and the bitter discipline of someone who refused to cry in front of a city that had taken so much. Her apartment looked untouched, as if she were only stepping out for coffee, but in truth, she was stepping out of an entire chapter of her life. The assistant, the shadow, the invisible mind behind someone else's empire. Gone. She had tried to sleep the night the accusation came, but sleep had no place between betrayal and clarity. Not when her face had been calm as she was escorted from the building. Not when her name had been stripped from her own email signature like a stain, and certainly not when Grant Maddox, the one man who claimed to see her, had stood still behind a wall of glass, watching her leave. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't stepped in. And that silence had been louder than any insult. She had heard the words the world didn't say: "We never really believed you belonged here." So she packed with steady hands, deleted the contacts that no longer mattered, forwarded her final check to a quiet charity in her mother's name, and booked a one-way ticket to Savannah, a place that didn't know her name, a place where she could start again. Meanwhile, Grant stood in his penthouse, unmoving. The city buzzed outside, but inside everything felt paralyzed. He hadn't gone to the office, he hadn't returned calls, he hadn't spoken to anyone about what happened, because deep down, he knew the weight of the decision hadn't fallen on his board, or his legal team, or the protocol. It had fallen on him. He had been the one with power, and he hadn't used it for her, not when it mattered. His phone had been filled with Olivia's name. Every update, every access code, every calendar entry, all traced back to her. She had been the heartbeat of his day-to-day, and now there was only silence. He opened her last email again. It was short. "Please redirect all remaining payments to this foundation. No further communication is necessary. I wish you well. No bitterness, no blame." That hurt more than any accusation could have, because it meant she wasn't surprised. He had become exactly the man she always feared he might be. 2 days passed, then 5. Grant tried to bury himself in work, but it all felt hollow. Deals, data, meetings, everything that once gave him control now felt irrelevant. He reviewed the investigation logs himself, spent nights alone decoding firewall breaches and server timestamps, and what he found sent a chill through him. Olivia hadn't accessed the encrypted systems. She had, in fact, flagged the vulnerabilities a week before the breach and sent a warning email. An email his cybersecurity team had ignored. She had done her job perfectly, and they had still cast her out. He could barely breathe. The truth scorched his pride like acid. He had betrayed her, not because she failed, but because he had chosen fear over faith. He pulled out his phone again, dialed. The number had been disconnected. He opened his laptop, found the tracking on the foundation donation. Savannah, a small rising consulting firm, had just listed a new senior partner, Olivia Hart. Of course. She hadn't collapsed. She had rebuilt, but without him. In Savannah, the morning air was quieter, sweeter. Olivia sat in a cafe tucked between 2 bookstores, sipping tea, reviewing strategy briefs for her first client. It wasn't Maddox Innovations, it wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. Her voice mattered, her decisions stood, and for the first time in a long time she felt her lungs open fully when she breathed. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She let it ring. She wasn't ready. She wasn't angry. Not anymore. But there was a wound inside her that hadn't stopped whispering, "He could have fought for you." And he didn't. That was the part she couldn't forget. That was the part that still kept her walls up, even when the pain softened. She closed her laptop and walked out into the sunlight, heels clicking softly on the old cobblestone streets of Savannah. She wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. She was just living. And as she disappeared into the curve of the street, unaware of the man who was already planning his quiet journey south, one truth remained. She had lost everything in New York, but she had reclaimed something far greater: herself. Savannah woke slowly, like a woman fully aware of her own beauty. Mornings didn't rush here. They breathed. Cars didn't scream. The wind took its time, and people looked each other in the eyes. Olivia Hart felt it in every step as she walked beneath moss-draped trees toward the small brick building that now housed her consulting firm. She no longer dressed in grey, no longer disappeared behind fabric and silence. That morning she wore a soft cream blouse with gold buttons, wide-legged linen trousers, and her hair loose around her shoulders, elegant, grounded, unapologetic. She had arrived in Savannah with little more than her resume, a suitcase, and a fire that no longer needed permission to burn. Within months, she had become the kind of woman people talked about, not loudly, but reverently. Her first client had been a struggling local bakery chain. She streamlined their operations, digitized their logistics, and built a partnership with sustainable farmers. Within 3 months, their profit margins doubled. Her second client was a group of young artists who dreamed of turning an abandoned theater into a cultural hub. Olivia didn't just write their pitch, she helped them secure funding, and with each project, her name spread. She wasn't flashy, she was precise. In downtown Savannah, people began calling her the woman who sees what others miss. She walked softly, but left echoes. And yet, even as her business blossomed, Olivia still carried pieces of the past. Some evenings, as she reviewed contracts alone in her quiet office, a question would stir beneath the calm. Why didn't he protect me? It wasn't about Grant Maddox anymore. Not really. It was about the silence, about all the rooms where she had been brilliant and unseen, about how a man who claimed to finally see her had turned away when she needed him most. But she didn't let that wound stop her. Because healing wasn't about erasing pain. It was about building something beautiful in its place. One afternoon, while presenting to a local startup run by 2 young women, one of them interrupted mid-pitch. "Sorry, but have you always been like this?" "Like what?" Olivia asked, curious. "So steady, so clear, like you're not afraid of anything." Olivia smiled gently. "I'm still afraid," she replied. "I just stopped letting fear decide who I am." The room went still. The girls looked at her not like a consultant, but like a mirror they had never seen themselves in before. That evening, Olivia left the office late. The sky above Savannah blushed in golden peach and rose, and the distant church bells chimed softly. She paused on the stone steps of the square and sat for a moment, alone, watching the town that had given her back to herself. She was no longer someone's assistant. She was no longer anyone's shadow. She was the CEO of her own story. Local papers began to mention her name. Community leaders invited her to speak. Women sought her guidance not for fame, but for clarity. But she still declined national interviews. She wasn't interested in turning her pain into spectacle, not yet. But Savannah was watching, and those who truly paid attention were starting to see. That same week, an elegant envelope arrived at her new office. A foundation dedicated to mentoring young women wanted to honor her at a private gala for a contribution she had made anonymously. The donation had been in her mother's name, as always. Now it had taken on a life of its own. She hesitated, not because of pride, but because part of her still flinched at being seen, really seen, and left unguarded. Still, she said yes, not for herself, but for the girls who needed to know that quiet strength was still strength. The night of the gala arrived. Olivia wore a deep sapphire gown, softer than the one in Manhattan. This dress didn't armor her. It revealed her light. Her earrings were small, her makeup minimal. And when she entered the room, there was no collective hush, no explosion of whispers. There was something more powerful. Respect. Not the kind that comes from fear or wealth, the kind earned in silence, over time. At the dinner table, a young girl with tight braids and wide, watchful eyes approached slowly. "I just wanted to say thank you." Olivia looked at her kindly. "For what?" "For donating to the program," the girl said, nervous. "And for letting your name be there. I've never seen someone who looks like me doing things like this. I needed to see that it was possible." Olivia's breath caught. Her heart pressed against her ribs like a rising tide. She reached out and gently held the girl's hand. "You don't need anyone to give you permission to shine," she said softly. "You just need to stay lit." That night, back at her apartment, Olivia lit a small candle on her windowsill, not for superstition, but for memory, for everything she had lost and everything she had become. She didn't know that across the country a man was landing quietly in Savannah. No cameras, no suits, no press, just one man, carrying the weight of 2 years of silence and a heart that had finally learned what it meant to lose something real. Grant Maddox had arrived, but he wasn't coming as a billionaire. He was coming as a man who had learned too late that respect means nothing if you don't show up when it counts. And what he didn't know yet was whether the woman Olivia had become still had room for the man he had once been. Savannah was nothing like Manhattan. The air was slower, the light warmer. The people smiled when they passed you on the street, even if they didn't know your name. For Grant Maddox, this unfamiliar rhythm was disorienting at first, like stepping out of armor into soft cotton. He arrived with no public announcement, no chauffeur, no tailored suit. Just a duffel bag, 2 weeks of clothes, and a mind full of mistakes. His first stop wasn't Olivia. It was silence. He checked into a modest inn near Forsyth Park, under a name no one would recognize. For the first time in his life, no one cared who he was. No one bowed to his money or his reputation, and strangely, he welcomed that. He needed space to strip himself down, not as a CEO, not as a man seeking redemption, but simply as someone who had broken something he couldn't buy back. Each morning, he walked the cobblestone streets in solitude, sat on benches beneath ancient oaks, watched mothers push strollers and old men play chess in the shade. And in that quiet, something began to shift inside him. For the first time, Grant allowed himself to think about the people his decisions had affected, not in numbers, not in profit margins, but as faces, as lives. He thought about Olivia, not just how she looked that night at the gala, but how she always showed up, the early mornings, the precision, the way she remembered details no one noticed, not because it was expected, but because she cared. And he thought about how easily he had let her go, not out of malice, but out of fear. He had built his entire world around the illusion of control. When the breach happened, when the board panicked, when the image cracked, he didn't step forward. He disappeared. And now, he was ready to change that. But change meant action. So Grant began, not with flowers, not with an apology, but with work. He reached out quietly to the same foundation Olivia had donated to, offered funding, not with his name on a plaque, but under hers. When they resisted, he insisted, make it anonymous, or give the credit to Olivia Hart. Then he contacted small businesses in Savannah, some of which had benefited from her consulting firm, not to take over, but to support. He asked what they needed, he listened, he funded without control. And all of it, he did in the background. He never announced himself, because this time it wasn't about being seen. It was about doing what he should have done before. One afternoon, he walked by the community center Olivia had helped restore. A mural of diverse women painted across the front wall caught his eye. He stared at it for a long time. Then someone tapped him on the shoulder. "Excuse me," said a teenage girl, eyes wide. "Are you Grant Maddox?" He froze. Yes," she smiled. "I recognized you from an article last year. You're the tech guy, Olivia Hart's old boss, right?" His throat tightened. "Yes, I was." The girl nodded. "She's kind of a legend around here now. Did you know that?" He looked up at the mural again. "I'm starting to understand," she shrugged. "Took you long enough." And with that, she walked off, leaving him stunned and quietly convicted. That night, Grant returned to his inn and opened his laptop. He drafted a letter, then deleted it. Wrote another, deleted that too. Nothing sounded right, everything felt small. What do you say to the woman who changed you after you failed to fight for her? In the end, he wrote something simple and mailed it. On paper, handwritten, no branding, no ego, just words. Dear Olivia, I came here without expecting anything. You don't owe me your time, your attention, or your forgiveness. I'm not writing to ask for any of those. I'm writing because I need to say something. Not for closure, but for truth. I was wrong, deeply, quietly, and shamefully wrong. Not just in how I handled the breach, but in how I saw you, or didn't. I failed to protect someone I admired, someone I respected, someone I cared for more than I let myself admit. You were never invisible. I was just blind. Since I've arrived, I've tried to contribute, quietly. I've asked nothing in return. That won't change. But if one day you decide to speak to me again, I'll be here, listening. No expectations, just presence. Grant. He mailed it and didn't follow up, didn't call, didn't knock on her office door. Because if there was one thing he had finally learned, it was this. Redemption is not something you ask for. It's something you prove moment by moment. Week by week, he remained in Savannah, volunteered quietly at a local youth mentorship program, met with founders of tech initiatives that Olivia had supported, donated to community projects anonymously, and when people asked who he was, he simply said, "I'm learning." And that wasn't a line. It was the truest thing he had ever said. He found peace in the slowness, in not needing to be impressive, in learning how to contribute instead of control. And one day, as he left a small cafe near the river, he spotted her. Olivia, standing across the street in a white blouse and navy skirt, her curls dancing in the breeze, laughing with a client as they exited a storefront. He didn't approach. He didn't wave. He simply stood still and watched. Not with longing, with reverence. Because she didn't need him to interrupt her world again. She needed to know he would honor it, even if it never included him. And in that quiet moment beneath the Georgia sun, he finally understood something that Data had never taught him. To love someone is not to possess them, it's to become someone worthy of standing beside them. The air in Savannah turned softer in April. Azaleas burst into bloom along garden fences. The sun lingered a little longer in the evening sky. And Olivia, now fully settled into her rhythm, had learned how to let the silence between work and rest stretch without guilt. Business was thriving. Her team had grown from just her to 3 dedicated consultants, all women, all brilliant, all determined to do things differently. She no longer answered every email herself, no longer said yes to every invitation. She chose what mattered, and quietly, she'd become one of the most respected strategic voices in the Southeast. But she still lived simply. She still walked to work, still bought the same kind of jasmine tea every Friday, still paused whenever someone mentioned New York, not with pain but with a subtle tightening in her chest. Some ghosts didn't haunt, they just hovered. One warm afternoon, Olivia sat in her office, reviewing a proposal for a citywide initiative to support underserved youth, a program that had been struggling for funding for months. The director had emailed her earlier in the week, hopeful but exhausted. "We need a miracle," the woman had written. Olivia leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment. She believed in miracles. She just didn't wait around for them. So she opened her laptop and began crafting a list of potential donors, pitch strategies, budget adjustments, the same kind of work that had always given her clarity. Then her assistant knocked gently. "Olivia, you should see this." She entered with a letter in hand. No envelope, just a printed acknowledgement from the foundation's treasurer. Olivia took it, read it once, then again. A 7-figure donation, no sender, anonymous. But the funds were designated specifically for the youth program, structured exactly in the way she had outlined in her initial proposal to the city. A document she had only shared with 3 people. One of them had been Grant Maddox. She stared at the letter, her throat suddenly dry. He had signed nothing, taken no credit. And yet, she knew, because it wasn't just the money. It was the method, the structure, the discretion, the precision. It was him. She said nothing for several seconds, then reached for her phone. Her hand hovered above the screen, and for the first time in over 2 years, she typed his number again, unsure if it was still his. She didn't call. She sent a message. "I know it was you. Can we talk?" Seconds passed, then minutes. She placed the phone face down on the desk, trying not to stare. Tried to return to the proposal, but her fingers trembled too slightly to type. Then the screen lit up. One reply. "Anytime, name the place." She read the words 3 times before exhaling. The next morning, she chose a quiet cafe by the river. Public, open, simple. He was already there when she arrived. No suit, no chauffeur. Just a linen shirt, dark jeans, and a nervous stillness in his eyes that she'd never seen before. He stood when he saw her, and for a second, neither spoke. She approached slowly. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he replied, voice low. They sat across from each other, the weight of unspoken years resting gently between them. "I got your letter," she began, not touching her coffee. "I hoped you would," he said. "It was honest. I needed it to be," he said. "I owed you more than silence." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "And the donation?" He didn't flinch. "It was never meant to be about me." Her eyes held his now, steady and searching. "But it was about me." His voice caught slightly. "Yes." Olivia looked down, then back up. "Why now?" He inhaled slowly. "Because I finally understood that regret without action is just performance. And I didn't come here to perform." She tilted her head. "So what did you come here for?" "To show up," he said. For once. The words landed with more weight than she expected. She leaned back in her chair. "I built something here," she said. "Without you, without your company, without your apology." "I know," he said softly. "That's what makes it real." The tension softened slightly. A breeze passed through the open window beside them. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The company?" "No," she said. "Me." He met her gaze without hesitation. "Every single day." Olivia didn't answer. Because the truth was, she had missed him too. But missing someone and trusting them again were 2 entirely different things. After a long pause, she said, "I don't know what this is." "It doesn't have to be anything," he said. "Just this. Just being here, listening." "And if I never say more than this?" she asked. "Then I'll still be here," he said, "in whatever way you'll allow." For the first time since she arrived, she smiled. Just a little. Not because she forgave him, but because maybe, just maybe, people really could change. And even if they didn't deserve a second chance, sometimes life offered it anyway. The sky over Savannah was clear the night of the event. Strings of warm lights draped across the courtyard of the newly restored Civic Hall, weaving between columns like starlight caught in motion. Round tables dressed in white linens and soft floral centerpieces lined the open-air patio, while subtle jazz floated beneath the conversations of business owners, city officials, and rising leaders. Tonight was Olivia Hart's night. 2 years after she had walked away from the towering shadows of Manhattan, she was being celebrated. Not for surviving, but for creating. Her firm had become a catalyst in the region, launching over 20 small businesses into financial stability and training more than 50 women to lead their own ventures. This wasn't a second act, this was a coronation. But Olivia didn't care for thrones. She cared about roots, about staying grounded. Still, she had agreed to speak at the closing of the event. Not because she loved the spotlight, but because she knew what it meant for the girls in the audience to see a woman like her on that stage. She arrived in an off-the-shoulder emerald dress, elegant, composed, glowing without trying. Her team surrounded her with laughter and pride, but Olivia's eyes scanned the crowd quietly as they moved. And then she saw him. Standing in the back corner, beside a low-hanging lantern, was Grant. He wore no tie. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the forearm. He wasn't talking to anyone, he was just watching. Not possessively, not like someone who expected to be seen, just watching. The way you do when you're proud of something that no longer belongs to you. Olivia felt a ripple move through her chest, one she quickly smoothed over with a sip of sparkling water. She turned back to her guests, but she had seen him, and he had seen her. Later that evening, the host approached the mic to introduce the closing speaker. Tonight we close with someone who didn't just build a company. She built a standard. A woman whose brilliance, resilience, and refusal to be ignored has changed the way this city sees leadership. Please welcome Olivia Hart. The applause was immediate, full, rising. Olivia stepped onto the small stage beneath a halo of soft light. She didn't speak right away. She looked at the crowd, not over them but into them. And when she finally spoke, her voice was clear and quiet, like someone telling the truth, not giving a performance. "When I arrived in Savannah, I came with more baggage than luggage," she said, a soft wave of laughter following. "I came burned out, broken open, but still unwilling to quit. I didn't know what I was going to build. I only knew what I refused to tolerate." She paused. "I was tired of brilliance being buried under silence, of rooms where power meant volume, and people like me had to prove we were allowed to speak." A few heads nodded. Some in the front wiped their eyes. "But this city gave me something I didn't expect," she continued. "It gave me space to try, to fail, to rebuild. It reminded me that leadership isn't about power, it's about presence. And tonight, I stand here not as someone who made it out, but as someone who finally walked into herself." There was a long pause, then thunderous applause. She stepped down as the band began to play again, trying to disappear back into the crowd. But the moment had settled into the atmosphere. People shook her hand, thanked her, took photos. But Grant never approached. He stayed where he was, near the back, leaning on the railing like someone who had no right to come closer, until Olivia turned and walked toward him. Slowly, deliberately. He straightened when she arrived. "You came," she said simply. "I told you I would," he replied. They looked at each other for a long moment. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. He hesitated. "Because this was your night. You earned this. I didn't want to interrupt." A soft breath left her lungs. "That's the first time you've ever said that," she said quietly. "Said what?" "That something belonged to me." He nodded once. "You were extraordinary up there," he said. "I wasn't trying to be," she replied. "That's why it worked." Another pause. Then she tilted her head. "So what now, Grant?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't expect anything." She studied him. "But you want something." He looked at her, no defenses left. "I want a chance," he said, "to show you who I am now, to earn whatever version of forgiveness you might offer, to stand beside you, not ahead, not behind, just beside." Her heart squeezed, not because it was romantic, because it was real. She looked away for a long second, fighting the quiet storm inside her. Then she met his eyes. "This is your only chance," she said. "No excuses, no more shadows. If you disappear again, you don't get to come back." "I won't," he said. "You'll have to prove that." "I will." Olivia nodded slowly, her gaze still locked on his. And somewhere in the middle of that crowded courtyard, between the soft glow of the lanterns and the echoes of jazz, a space opened. A space where two people could begin again. Not because it was easy, but because they had finally arrived in the same place, at the same time. The following morning, Savannah woke in gold. Sunlight filtered through the trees like honey, brushing the brick sidewalks and dancing over front porches still quiet from the night before. The city felt softer somehow, as if it too had witnessed something sacred in the courtyard the night before. In Olivia's apartment, quiet reigned. She stood at her window, a cup of tea warming her hands, barefoot, robe wrapped loosely around her. Her curls tumbled gently down her back, and there was no makeup on her face, only clarity in her eyes. She hadn't slept much, not from doubt, but from something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the kind you force, the kind you earn. After walking through fire, the night before had shifted something inside her, not because of what Grant said, but because of how he said it. Without performance, without pressure, just presence. And for the first time she allowed herself to imagine something that had once felt impossible, that maybe people really could change, Not because you begged them to, but because they chose to. Later that afternoon, Grant waited on the bench beneath the oak tree near the bookstore, the one Olivia had mentioned she visited every Saturday. He didn't text, he didn't ask, he just waited. If she came, she came. If not, he would still be there. And then, just as the church bells rang twice, she appeared. White sundress, woven sandals, a book tucked under one arm. She stopped in front of him, one brow slightly raised. "You know I hate surprises," she said. "I wasn't sure this qualified," he said. "I'm in plain sight." She smiled faintly. "You're learning." He stood, unsure whether to move closer. She sat on the bench first. He joined her, leaving space. They didn't speak right away. The breeze carried the scent of magnolia between them, and then Olivia said, "Do you know why I left New York without a word?" He turned his head toward her. "Because I didn't deserve one." "No," she said, "because if I had said anything, I would have stayed." He blinked. "I still cared," she admitted, "even when I was furious, even when you didn't speak for me. And that scared me more than being fired." He listened, fully. "I had to walk away, Grant. Not just from you. From the version of me that thought silence was safer than being seen." He nodded slowly. "And now," she said, "I speak, and I choose. Not out of fear, but out of strength." He looked at her then, truly looked. Not as someone trying to earn her love, but as someone in awe of what she had become, and maybe always was. "I want to be worthy of the woman you are now," he said quietly. "Then don't chase me," she replied. "Walk beside me. I can do that." "You'll have to prove it," she said. "Every day," he promised. She turned to him fully now. There was no hesitation, only calm, only clarity. "Then let's begin," she said. He smiled, wide and honest. "Begin what?" "This," she said, gesturing to the space between them. "Whatever this becomes." And with that she reached out, not for his hand, but for his presence. She rested her head gently on his shoulder, eyes closed, heart steady. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. Because love, real love, doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in forgiveness, in shared silence, in the decision to try again, not because it's easy, but because it matters. And beneath the oak tree, under the golden light of a city that had taught them both how to slow down and see, a billionaire and a woman once called invisible sat together, no longer running from anything, not the past, not the truth, not each other. Just stillness, and the beginning of something real. He built empires with silence. She rebuilt herself with truth. And in the end, it wasn't the power he held that changed their story. It was the way he finally stood still and saw her. Because sometimes, real love doesn't arrive with grand gestures, but in the quiet decision to stay. And maybe the question isn't who we were before, but who we choose to become when love finally meets us ready. If this story touched your heart, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? Your presence means more than you know.